With the last lecture, we were looking at the characteristics of iambic pentameter, Shakespeare's meter of choice, and understanding what meter meant. This time we'll look at variation within Shakespearean verse. And Shakespeare varies among three different characteristic types of writing: blank verse, rhymed verse, and prose. And when you understand these three basic characteristics of his writing, you'll understand how he achieves a number of different purposes: creating mood within a scene, tone of somebody's speech, characterization of the speaker, and understanding of relationships among characters. So let's start. Blank verse indicates lines of unrhymed verse with fixed meter. So the iambic pentameter lines, fixed meter, that means fairly regular, usually 10 syllables per line, occasionally a 9 or 11 syllable line with no rhyme. Such is the case with the line in Measure for Measure in Act 1, Scene 1, lines 3 to 15. Of government the properties to unfold would seem in me to affect speech and discourse, since I am put to know that your own science exceeds in that the lists of all advice my strength can give you. Then no more remains but that to your sufficiency as your worth is able, and let them work. The nature of our people, our city's institutions, and the terms for common justice, you're as pregnant and as art and practice hath enriched any that we remember. There is our commission, from which we would not have you warp. Call hither, I say, bid come before us Angelo. This is typical blank verse. And you can see that some variation exists with the meter unit. However, for the most part, we have the typical iambic line, and we do not have rhymes at the end of each line. The next type of writing is rhymed verse. And rhyme verse is exactly what you might think. Once again, this is poetry, which ends in a patterned rhyme. Now, Shakespeare doesn't use this as often as you might think. He is a poet, but he does not use the rhyme as a rhythm device. And there's a very clear reason for that. Rhyme is a sort of a loaded weapon. When you use rhyme, you affect a rather childish and somewhat simplistic and jovial attitude, something that's not very serious. So rhyme is not necessarily useful for somebody who's a lord, a noble person, for they are often very serious in what they are saying. It's also not very useful for a very lower class person, because a lower class person wouldn't be clever enough to speak with the structure of a patterned rhyme. One of the best examples of a Shakespearean character that rhymes would be Puck from A Midsummer Night's Dream, a character who is intelligent, very clever, and yet very mischievous, very childlike. He is a fairy who flies around the narrative, introducing love potions and sleeping potions into characters on the stage, often to chaotic and comedic result. And he rhymes a lot. And Shakespeare uses that to underscore his comedy, underscore his mischievousness, and how he is very childlike in nature. Shakespeare occasionally uses rhymed verse to lighten the mood of a certain scene, to introduce a lighter tone, and a fight which occurs between two characters in words may suddenly take on rhyme. That rhyme indicates, or at least Shakespeare is indicating through that rhyme, that the subject under discussion is rather silly, that the fight is not to be taken seriously. This can lighten the mood of the entire play. There's another way in which Shakespeare uses rhyme. Shakespeare uses rhyme quite often when he is ending a scene, and these. Sorry, let me flip these. There's a mistake there. Shakespeare uses a very simple rhyme scheme. If he's rhyming, he's generally rhyming couplets, so A A B B. And these lines, once again from Measure for Measure, would end the scene. Shakespeare often uses couplets, sometimes two couplets, as you can see here, to end a scene. And this provides sort of a punctuation mark, an ending that the readers and, of course, the audience would understand. A character might speak a rather long speech, maybe a soliloquy, or a character might be leaving a scene, or the scene itself might be ending, and Shakespeare would end with the couplet. This does not necessarily present any sort of jovial or childlike atmosphere. It simply provides a wrap-up, a conclusion. It's almost like a drum beat at the end of a song. This lets everybody know that the song or the scene or the speech is over. The last of these three is prose. Now, prose is very important to understand, and it's very simple, but a lot of people don't understand what this means. Prose is the antonym of poetry. Prose is regular speech without rhyme or meter, so it's not poetry. I am speaking prose right now. I am forming my thoughts into complete sentences, which derive their meaning from the structure of the sentence, not from the structure of the line. I'm not calculating the rhythm of my speech. I'm not thinking about the accented versus unaccented syllables. I'm simply speaking. Every time you write an essay, you are writing prose. Every time you write a letter, you are writing prose. Every time you speak to one another, you are speaking prose, unless for some reason you decide to freestyle some poetry, in which case you are speaking verse, but I'm willing to bet that doesn't happen very often. Here's a prose line from Measure for Measure, once again, Act 1, Scene 2, lines 34 to 37. And this is Lucio speaking in the bar, speaking rather rudely, if you remember some of the import of his message here. I think thou dost, and indeed with most painful feeling of thy speech, I will, out of thine own confession, learn to begin thy health, but, whilst I live, forget to drink after thee. If you look at the character of a Shakespearean line written in prose, on the page itself, you'll see that it's justified to the right. Unfortunately, the Smart Notebook software will not allow me to do that. Let me go back to this for a moment. It will not allow me to justify this, but if it did, you'd see that, and hold on a second, let me pull up a line here. You would see that the words would end all at the same place here as they do on this side. The margins would be flush. And just as I and M and W are all flush to this side, the H and I and N and E would all be flush to this side. So if you look at your Oxford School Shakespeare edition, it's formatted properly. Prose just runs on from one line to the next. So with blank verse, the line ends because the iambic pentameter unit is complete. With prose, the line simply ends because, well, the margin has been reached and it must wrap around. It's the same as when you're typing in something like Microsoft Word. You simply type and type and type, and you do not return until you are, or press enter until you are to the end of a paragraph. Well, the same thing happens with prose in Shakespeare. If it's properly formatted on the page, it will look different from the blank verse speech. So learn just to look at the appearance of lines on the page before you actually start to count syllables or analyze it in any closer fashion. So, to wrap up, these are the three: blank verse, rhymed verse, and prose. And Shakespeare will shift among those three to create meaning. And if you want to understand what kind of meaning he creates, well, stop back for part 3.